Howdy, folks. My name is Greg Farrar. This is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. Almost called it a podcast. Maybe someday I'll have a podcast, but for now I've got a live stream with 50 subscribers. Woohoo! So, we'll start with the countries, and after that we'll go to states.
My name is Greg Farrar.
This is my COVID again. About every other time that happens. I don't even know if you can hear it, but I'm guessing you can. My own voice comes back to me on a delay. The nice thing about that is it proves to me that my sound is working, and one of the times it wasn't. So, oh well, mixed bag there. Countries, then the states of the United States, and then the counties of California. So, when we look at the countries, the United States, of course, leads in total cases. It's the only thing that's not boring about this graph, I think, is that we're starting to see horizontal lines. This section down here, certainly not this one, which is steadily angled upwards. This section down here has a few, like we can probably pick out the United Kingdom that's going diagonally, but a lot of these look pretty horizontal, and that indicates a peak. It means that not just a peak, but the end of the recovery. It's the end of the hill. When these lines go horizontal, that means the total cases is unchanging day over day, which means there are no new cases each day. So that will happen eventually, probably. And we're starting to see that. We're definitely seeing a trend towards that. These lines are looking more horizontal than they were a month ago. And what that means, the way we'll see that is on this graph, the graph of the new cases per day, those lines go horizontal when these lines hit zero. And so we definitely see places like Russia and Brazil that certainly not only haven't hit zero, but are trending upwards or still pointed upwards. But in the new cases, we do see some, the United States being one of them, that is trending towards zero. There's not too much doubt, I think, looking at this, that there's a downward trend to the United States. I actually had a different graph up. I think I can just click this and it'll show it. Same data shown, actually same source, I think worldometers.info. Maybe that's not the source I'm using, but it shows the 30-day moving average of the United States, and we can see really it looks like it's trending downwards, that average. Kind of hard to see in the noisy data. But our trend line also, which doesn't wave with the data but tries to take a very big picture, is pointing downwards. Used to be at 30,000 a day, now it's at 25,000 a day. So the United States has a pronounced downward trend. But by no means has it reached zero, even with this latest day being rather good relatively, speaking at 22,000, we still are far from zero. But there are other, if we zoom in on some of the other countries, it's going to mess it up, is it? My graphs sometimes get screwed up. I'll see if it'll let me do that on this one. If not, then I'll reload this page, and that usually fixes it. All right, so we see, for instance, Spain, which is a fairly major feature of this graph. Spain is the highest peak we have. Looks like Singapore over here might eventually be the highest peak we have in this is per capita, but Spain peaked here at a little over 120 per million of daily infections, but it's now down to 12 or something, 11 per million. So it's seen a 90% decrease, and it is very near zero at this point, and it seems to be headed, it's not even, if we look a little closer, there's no sense that it's even flattening out into some sort of long tail. It's just heading linearly down in a straight line towards zero. And if this were to continue, we would expect Spain to have zero cases in a day or two. Now, there's got to be some degree of a long tail on this where you never quite reach zero, and there are always a few cases here and there, but we're really not seeing that so far in this graph. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. We drop to 20, we drop to 10. It really looks like we're going to be at zero in one day. Will Spain actually hit zero new cases in one day? Probably not. But it's certainly heading down more sharply than I would have expected. The United States, on the other hand, is doing something very different. We're having peaked, it's heading very slowly downward. I would generally expect, I think Italy has Italy peaked so long ago it's hard to tell, but Italy is heading downward at a slower pace, but also clearly heading towards zero in the next week or so. Now, again, it would be very strange if these actually hit zero, because all you need is one person coming from New York or California and going to Spain, and now they have a case. So I expect we'll never hit zero in these cases, but there may be individual days that are zero. But on the whole, I don't expect us to hit zero, and maybe until vaccine time, and maybe not even then. So, but still, the trend is towards much lower than it was, and however it flattens out, it's going to flatten out. I'm guessing Spain will flatten out below 20 per million, which is, it's already there, and I think that I don't expect it to suddenly shoot up again, but we'll see. There have been times, even recently, when Spain suddenly didn't look quite as good. It looked like it was trending slightly upwards, or at least it was bending into more of that flattening out long tail curve that we would kind of expect, but you wouldn't see it from this graph. We'll see what the rope chart says. That's the one that really tells us where these trends are headed. Oops, I meant to just show the UK. UK is doing a little bit like the United States, probably peaked, but is really more like a plateau. And then we have Germany, which is also doing quite well, having peaked around 60 per million. It's down to 8 per million. Maybe starting to show a little bit of that long tail leveling out at a low number, but regardless, this is very good news. Anyone who has this kind of shape is looking quite good. Russia, however, does not have that kind of a shape. And in fact, we now have something that, it's starting to look like a trend, a sudden spike as a trend. Russia, we have, with 3 data points in a row, we start to be able to say, yeah, this is actually probably not just noise. It's not just randomly above, like for instance, this point, which was sort of randomly high. Actually, that probably wasn't randomly high. That was probably this 0 being double reported, as they reported twice on a day. But this point may be randomly low, or this point was randomly high. These are, for the day or two, we were saying, well, maybe Russia just had a single high day. But not likely with 3 in a row. Still possible that this is just a weekly swoop that we sometimes see, or a bit of noise, but given the graph so far, I'm guessing Russia actually is experiencing some sort of phenomenon, and that could be an infection, a burst of infection, and I think in the case of Russia it actually is. They really are seeing more infections, but it could also be that they're just testing a lot more people, and so we're seeing more cases because they're being caught by higher testing. But the news out of Russia is not good. The pictures and social media posts we see coming out of Russia suggest that Russia may be the worst of all the top countries right now. France is looking great. Turkey's looking okay. Brazil is also not looking great, but it's not as bad as Russia. Russia has a lot more per capita, and it had a sudden spike, which Brazil's not showing that kind of spike. It's still heading upward, but it's fairly steady. Iran's looking okay. It's trending downward, having already peaked. Canada not looking so great, but again, no one's as bad as Russia right now. Looking at the rope chart, the growth, I'm definitely not going to let it deny me my precious rope chart. So I'm going to reload this page. I had my usual glitch. Sometimes when I double click, the graph completely goes away, or at least the lines on the graph go away. Reload just takes a few seconds and we get our rope chart back. Our precious rope chart. This time it'll work, because it almost always does after I reload. Something about sitting there for too long that it gets tired. But the rope chart is looking pretty good. Growth rates, this 0 line around here indicates when a country has turned the corner. And we see a lot of countries are not just below 0, but accelerating downward. Their growth, they're seeing fewer and fewer new cases each day. And every single country here below 0, with the exception of Iran, is accelerating in its drop in growth. They're all angled downward, I guess. Maybe Switzerland's somewhere near horizontal, but most of these are pointing downward. And we have the really extreme case of Singapore. Singapore had a real spike. Everyone got worried about them. They got over it. We see this over and over. Singapore now, after being extraordinarily high, is now extraordinarily low, at least in its speed, and its acceleration downward is the angle of this line is very steep. And so Singapore with 5% or almost 10% fewer cases each day, fewer new cases, is also accelerating downward. This won't continue forever. Eventually it'll level off, but Singapore is looking very good. France, generally lately we've seen the European countries all looking, that's all of the top, yeah, if you count Turkey among the European countries, not too far away, I guess. We have the top 7 or so of the best looking countries are all European. And because they all have this double characteristic that we like to see, which is negative growth in new cases and accelerating. And then we have Italy also, Sweden, which was we've kept a particularly close eye on because they've done a much milder lockdown. Some would say no lockdown at all. Sweden, however, 5% reduction of daily cases and accelerating downward. And in fact, no, I thought that might be a Sweden data point. Let's look at Sweden separately for a moment. Yeah, it just looks pretty good. Pretty good. They've had some very good days. All their recent days have been negative growth. So Sweden's looking good. And then we have the bad news, which I'm guessing is going to be Central South America, but we do have India here. India actually arguably is the worst right now with a positive growth, not a terrible growth rate at 8%, but that's a fairly significant daily growth rate. Positive growth rate on average for India and accelerating upwards. So India is looking problematic, as we've been worried it would. It seemed for a while like they kind of had let's look at India more closely. You can kind of see that they had a trend downward and they've had some negative growth days, but now 5 days in a row, and each of these is an average of 3 days. So these are 5 kind of denoised days in a row. 5 days in a row of over 5% daily growth in India. So India has got a runaway problem there. It's not extreme, it's not 20%, it's not a sharp angle upwards, but it's got both of the characteristics we least like to see, which is positive growth and accelerating. So India's one of our hotspots. Chile, also very much like India in the shape of its curve and its position. Ecuador was problematic and then seemed like it got a little better. Actually, yeah, Ecuador also has a real curve to it here. Let's see if we can take another look. Ecuador, I think, was not even on our radar. It's not even on our top 25 when I first started doing this a month or 2 ago. And then it crept into 25th place, and now it just keeps moving upwards. So Ecuador just keeps growing. It has its good days. You can see all these points below zero, but most days are above zero, and some of them are really above zero. 77% growth of new cases, especially something like this. 65% growth of new cases when it's already this far up the list, meaning it has a lot of cases already. That's really dramatic. And so it's got its good days and its bad days, and overall the trend line isn't terrible, but it still is positive and accelerating. And we have some very bad days for the past 4 days for Ecuador, 20% plus for 4 days straight. Let's look at Ecuador's overall numbers. Okay, so ignoring this ridiculous day, I don't really know what that was about. It was probably a bunch of catching up on a bunch of cases. We're seeing 2,000 cases a day, 2,000 new cases every day, and growing on average. You can see the general trend is upwards. So when we do that 3-day averaging we do, the rope chart is saying we've had a lot of growth day over day. As recently as the 24th of April, we saw 300 cases. Now we see 2,000 cases. That's a huge growth. And if you compare it to the United States, well, the United States is seeing 10 times more cases, but Ecuador is closing that gap. It's only 10 times more cases. It's less than more than a tenth what the United States has. And Ecuador is not a very huge country. Let's look in the per million, comparing Ecuador, say, and the United States. Per million, Ecuador and the United States. Yeah, look at that. Ecuador has just passed the United States solidly a couple days in its per million numbers. So Ecuador is really seeing a problem right now. Ecuador has passed the United States per capita. Where were we? Here, I think. looking at some of the other problematic countries. So we saw India, we saw Ecuador, Central South America. We have, well, these aren't actually jumping out as Central South America, but we do have Peru, Brazil. These ones are at least trending slightly downward. Brazil has been a hot spot of sorts, at least a worry spot. And it's still not great with 4% new cases every day, but that's trending downward. So Brazil is not right now looking all that bad. Saudi Arabia is recovering, looks likely to turn the corner in a day. Brazil could turn the corner with this trend line within a week. Russia, Mexico also has been problematic, but at least is trending downward. Pakistan, pretty high growth rate. No one here is in the 20 range, which we sometimes see, but 6% growth day over day, but trending downward. So the real problem spots are Russia, India, and Ecuador. And no other country is really alarming. In fact, with less than 10% growth rates, even those three aren't as alarming as some things we've seen in the past, like when we saw I think it's Singapore at some point had more than 20% growth rate on a daily basis, though now the curve is kind of averaged other days and it looks like it never went much above 15. But still, these growth rates aren't huge, but at least the trend of the growth rate isn't huge. But in the case of the trend lines, growth rate isn't huge when it has averaged out some of these other days. But when you look at Ecuador alone, again, some of the growth rates really are huge. 65%, 34%, 22, 20. So Ecuador has this short-term trend. 4 points, especially each of them averaging 3, is enough to really believe in it. It has a short-term trend that is very alarming. On the other hand, they've had trends like this before. Like here is a little trend, 3 days in a row, which normally I'd say that's enough to call a trend. But then suddenly they were below 0 for the following 3 days. So we'll watch Ecuador, but it's the worst right now, or one of the worst. Total world cases is flat. We're not accelerating upward with more and more cases each day. We've got a tiny mini trend downward, but I wouldn't really believe it. We had a huge mini trend upward and didn't really believe that either. This all feels kind of just like noise. Different countries pulling in different directions, but the net is flat. And you see that on the rope chart here as well, where it's absolutely following that 0 line for weeks on end. The world is not getting better, but it's not getting worse. The deaths similarly there are a lot of countries that are looking better, but as we see the world as a whole, and here's the rope for deaths. Well, the rope chart for deaths is actually, it does indicate that deaths are improving worldwide. But when you look at something like the rope chart as the whole world saying, well, we're not getting better, or this very, very flat line saying we're not getting better, and you compare it to the rope chart of the world, it is interesting, because at first glance I'd say we're getting better. Look at all those lines heading downward and not too many heading upwards. But apparently the ones that are below 0 are not contributing as many anymore. As we saw, things like Spain and Europe, they've recovered so fully in many cases. Spain, 90% fewer cases. Spain has recovered so fully that it doesn't contribute as much anymore. And so some of the littler countries like Ecuador or India, India is not exactly a littler country, but in the cases, in the sense of its contribution to COVID-19 cases worldwide, I think we're just seeing a lot of the smaller countries, and even the ones that aren't on our top 25, pulling the world upwards as they have their own mini epidemics. So even though broadly this looks pretty good, there's still too much momentum up above, or it exactly offsets the momentum below. I do think we're going to see, I'm guessing we're going to see this drop. It seems inevitable that we'll see this drop. Eventually we'll see this drop. We'll see that the world rope chart head steadily negative as the whole world finally peaks as a whole and starts to decline. But we may still see countries like Russia and India, which totally have the potential to blow this out of the water, and India especially, or even China could get back in the game, and the places with a lot of population we could see them experiencing major epidemic growth and pulling this northward. But generally, that's not what we're seeing. We seem to have, as a world, we have the ability to contain outbreaks when they happen pretty quickly in a matter of weeks. And so nothing since Italy, nothing since Europe and New York have really run away. New York and Europe, for whatever reason, really lost their grip on that, on the epidemic, but nobody else has. I don't think there are any other. And China didn't. China could have been terrible, and they locked it down. They had it first and locked it down. Apparently, and this is all based on reported numbers, Russia even seems to be locking it down. If we trust the numbers that these countries are giving us, it appears that everybody has managed to put a lid on this thing, with the exception of, I'd say, New York especially, and the countries, certain countries in Europe. And they still see mini epidemics, but they never seem to rise to this really high level. And if that continues, then yes, the rope chart will drop for the world, as it has already in deaths. And I often say, well, the deaths look a lot like the cases. The death charts look like the cases charts, so I don't even bother with them. But this is a place where that's really not true. For whatever reason, the deaths have been dropping even though the cases aren't dropping. And I speculate it has to do with treatment. Could have something to do with reporting, but we have some actual treatments, though those treatments don't reduce deaths. The antiviral that I can never pronounce, remdesivir or something, it doesn't reduce deaths as far as the early studies show, so it shouldn't be the cause of this. Maybe it's just that the healthcare systems are no longer overtaxed and they're able to treat people. Maybe there were people who didn't get ventilators at all who died. I don't know, maybe all these cases in the retirement communities, maybe they've kind of run through the retirement communities. There were just a huge number. I think it was Italy, something like 50% of the deaths were in retirement communities. And eventually you kind of run out of old people to kill. And then all you can do is work on the young people, and they just don't die as easily. So that may be why the deaths are dropping. Yeah. Rope chart again, 5% drop. And that's, I think we're seeing that in general. There are certain hot spots, but once you hit a hot spot, once the virus hits a hot spot and infects everyone there, and I'm talking micro hot spots like the jail in Ohio, then there's nothing more it can do, and so it dies out in that particular hotspot as long as it's contained. And I think we've gotten very good at containing, like Washington State wouldn't let anyone visit the old folks' homes, in Italy as well, because they were just so dangerous. They had so many people with the virus, and so what it did do is kill a lot of people there in those micro hotspots, but it did not then spread to Washington State as a whole and do anything like that, that degree of mayhem. Let's talk about testing. I think there's something weird here, maybe. What is this? Maybe this is what we're seeing. Portugal? What are you doing, Portugal? Portugal has great percentages, but we're showing no recent testing? Or, yeah, okay, Portugal, for whatever reason, we've lost our data on this, so eventually this is going to do some sharp downward thing, but from what we can see, it surely has continued to test. We just don't have data on it, and Portugal is doing best in population, which is new. Just a few weeks ago, Portugal was kind of well, it's always been okay, but I don't think of Portugal as the world leader in testing among the top 25. What happened to Belgium? Is it Belgium? Yeah, Belgium is doing really well. When you see all these dots above the trend line, it means that they've accelerated so rapidly that the trend line hasn't caught up yet. So this is clearly the new trend line, and Belgium is going as fast as anyone except Portugal in terms of the speed at which they're testing. Italy as well, very well. Russia, United States, and Canada also doing quite well. These are Canada. Canada has outpaced its trend line. Let's look at the United States. Okay, for some reason we don't have data for a couple of days in the United States. but the trend line is clearly upwards and also accelerating, because you can see those points are above the trend line. Probably accelerating. It could be that the trend line is just being pulled down by those. But in any case, 2%. 2% tested, that is a respectable figure for the United States as a whole. And when we look at the speed of testing, no, what is this? Tested by country. I still haven't fixed my name. Oh, that's right. These are just all the countries. Iceland, as usual, is the hands-down winner with 15% tested. Bahrain, Luxembourg. Luxembourg is the one I was remembering. It's like, where's Luxembourg on this graph? But Luxembourg isn't on the graph because it's not in the top 25. They had, as I recall, a real outbreak, but I think maybe they even were in the top 25. I think they were until even recently. But Luxembourg has apparently recovered, is well on its way to recovery. We don't have data on it because I'm only looking at top 25, but if I remember correctly, Luxembourg was in the top 25, which is crazy given their size. Maybe it was only when I looked at the top 50. But in any case, Luxembourg is not in the top 25 and is doing apparently rather well, and certainly is doing well in testing. Let's move on to the states. I'm just going to reload this. Proactive reload this thing, because I fear it's going to mess up my graphs if I don't. If I were a little bit more on top of things, I'd switch tabs quickly and reload so I wouldn't have to talk filler while it reloads, but reloads are not that. They're pretty quick. Okay, well, total cases, New York, of course, leading, but look at that nice underreaching of its trend line. That means that New York is getting over it in a very visible way, even on this most extreme of graphs, the total cases. Even on this graph, we can see that New York is trending in a good direction. We'll see that much more clearly on other graphs. Also, somewhat New Jersey. New Jersey is the second. But the total cases, I think, are less interesting, at least for prediction purposes. They're much more dramatic, but for prediction purposes, I like the daily cases in the rope chart, the growth trends. What's interesting here is New York has recovered so much that it is about to be passed by Illinois. Illinois is in trouble. New York is not in trouble. New York is doing very well, trending downward. We'll talk more about Illinois, but Illinois is doing quite poorly, and while New York very clearly is heading in the right direction. From its peak where it was seeing 10,000 cases, we now see, on the latest day, 2,500. So 75% drop in cases. This is just one day, but even looking at the trend line, it has a third as few cases as it used to every day. If we look at some of the other states, we see a real trend downward for some of these. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but there are a lot of states that are showing that hill shape. Pennsylvania, we already talked about New Jersey, which is looking very good. Who else? Louisiana, looking very good. I think, unless that's it too. No, that's North Carolina. So what we're definitely not seeing is a lot of lines shooting upwards sharply, but we are seeing that for Illinois. And then we see other trends like Iowa, which just doesn't have that many cases per capita, so we can't really tell whether it might be shooting upwards from here, but that's where the rope chart comes in. Oh, that was total. I was thinking per million. Per capita is the per capita look is also interesting. When you look at it per capita, New York has long since lost the lead. It's about 7th now. Rhode Island, as we've seen, had a real spike, but is clearly flattening off and getting over it. Massachusetts appears to be flattening off. New Jersey is doing very well. Connecticut doing well. Illinois, though, whether on a per capita basis or not, is having problems. Illinois, in terms of a total number of cases, is actually, as we see, it's looking like it'll be number 2 pretty soon, or number 1, I mean, in the nation, in terms of new daily cases, and it's just heading upwards. If we're lucky, we'll find that Illinois is, that though it has a lot of cases and it has a lot of new cases each day, the rope chart will show that it's trending back towards zero, trending toward turning a corner. If we're unlucky, we'll see it accelerating. I actually don't remember which it is, but we'll find out. And then we have a few others like Maryland and Iowa, which aren't looking so great. Again, Iowa popping up here as a potential hotspot. Per capita, Iowa is above the pack now, and it doesn't seem to show any signs of leveling out. This looks like this really is just the trend line with some noise around it. So Iowa is definitely one to watch. Same with Virginia. Virginia not leveling out, but then we see a lot of these just seem to be level. They're flat or downward. I don't believe this one. Obviously, Indiana does not have negative cases every day, as the trend line suggests, and it's just because for some reason we're missing a lot of days now of data from Indiana. So we do not know what's happening in Indiana. Let's go to the rope chart. So the rope chart's not looking so good. It's not terrible, but here's that zero line, and the country as a whole has a lot of states below zero and a lot of states above zero, which means they're growing. The only two to really worry about are these two, Missouri and Washington. Interesting that Washington is popping up here again. Washington is having some sort of a resurgence. I've been gradually watching Washington come back into being a major player. They had so few cases. Let's see where they are per capita. I think they're going to be quite small per capita. Yeah. Okay, so Washington is so small per capita. 24 cases per million, whereas New York, for instance, has seen 400. Washington is still pretty small per capita in terms of total numbers, or it's not still pretty small, it's back to being pretty small. It was higher. Its total numbers, okay, so this just happens when the numbers get small enough. We see this up, and it's just noise, I think. The line is pretty steady. Washington doesn't look bad from this graph, but the rope chart says, oh no, we've been heading upwards for a long time. We're seeing a high percentage of growth each day. That's terrible. But then there's one day, which is low, and the rope chart hasn't caught hold of it yet. I'd say ignore the rope chart on this one. There's nothing to worry about in Washington. Yes, technically they have a very high growth rate day over day, but that's within such a small range. Less than 500. They had 150, then they had 220, then they had 300, 360, and that seems like a bad trend, but when you look at their long term, they just do that sometimes, and I think it's just pure random chance that they happen to have 5 days in a row that looked like they were steadily, strongly rising. So we'll ignore the rope chart for Washington and say it's not a problem, probably. If it keeps going, sure, but as you see, the most recent day has bucked the trend. And then there's Missouri. Now, is Missouri real? They've got a 10% and sharply rising. That definitely is something to worry about. But let's again go back to their actual new cases and try to get a sense of, is this noise? So Missouri has so few cases. If we look at Missouri, like as we looked at Washington, we say, all right, Missouri really does show an upward trend here, short term, and the rope chart does show short-term trends, but not enough cases to worry about yet. Sure, they have an upward trend. It'll be a while though. If they keep this up, then if they stay at this 10% over and over and over for 10 days or 20 days, then yes, Missouri will become a force to be reckoned with in COVID land. But mostly, they have a troubling mini trend here, but not enough cases to worry yet. Wisconsin's fairly flat, not too bad. Iowa, we're seeing Iowa. Okay, so Iowa is trending downwards, which is nice. They don't have a very high growth rate, and they're trending downwards. Let's look at Ohio, because Ohio is, I'm flashing Ohio here. Ohio had its problems appear to be behind it. Ohio's doing well. Rhode Island also had its problems, and they're behind it. Connecticut, looking good. Colorado, interestingly, Colorado had its problems. It is waved in different directions at different times, but right now Colorado is looking great. It's the best in the nation in its short-term growth rate. It's seeing a 10% reduction day over day. Let's see what that actually means in the case of Colorado. Where does it fit with these other places? So part of the problem, as we've seen when we look at Colorado, is it missed for some reason 4 days of data. We didn't get those days. It didn't report them maybe, and then suddenly it reported them all in one day. So it's easy to say, oh my gosh, we're seeing this great trend downward from this really high number to these really low numbers, but that number isn't real. It was probably right along this line the whole time. That said, it does look like there have been some pretty steep days in Colorado, and that we're not seeing them. Over a couple days of more than, in the range of 1,000, and now 3 days of under 500. So it's not enough days to say much about, but I don't think that the rope chart is wrong in saying there's a really good trend happening in Colorado here. We had some very bad days. Maybe this was just a double reported day, but even so, it would have been somewhere on the trend line. We seem to be seeing a mini trend of 5 or 6 days steadily downward in Colorado, which is good, especially because Colorado has opened up more than most states and earlier than most states. So the effects of opening up won't show up for another week or so, but we are seeing that at least if they'd known what the trend was going to look like when they opened up, they probably wouldn't have second-guessed opening up. They would have said, yeah, this is okay. The trend is reasonable. We're not having a terrible epidemic here. We wanted to open up. We're going to open up, and this doesn't give us reason to think we shouldn't. So evidence suggests Colorado may have been reasonable in retrospect, opening when they did. Now we see the trend, the downward trend. And maybe the people who made the decisions knew these 5 data points, which I don't know about, and could see this coming. Maybe. California's, well, so this is just the total cases. They have these mini trend downward that then gets broken, and the mini trend downward. California seems okay from this graph. I'm going to guess that the rope chart is actually going to look pretty good for California, that it's going to say we're seeing at least roughly flat or maybe slightly downward in the short term, which is what the rope chart shows. Certainly in the short term, we seem to see a general downward trend for California. Hard to say. Let's see what the rope chart actually says. I thought that might be it. Where is California then? Okay, yeah, the rope chart has pretty good news for California. It thinks we don't have the latest day for some reason, or maybe this is the latest day. No, it's not. But we do have a very good day, fairly good day, slightly good day, at 5% reduction day over day, and the trend appears to be dropping. So the short-term news for California is good. California is heading in a good direction. Let's look at them separately. We've had some bad days, but then we've had some good days, and overall the trend appears to be slightly in the towards negative growth. We've had a couple of days of negative growth and a whole cluster of them back there, and then a couple bad ones, and put it all together, the rope chart thinks California is doing okay. Georgia, we've always been interested in because they also were a little lax on their opening. They're hanging in there. They're still seeing growth. They're not getting better right now, but they're hanging in there. So we'll keep an eye on Georgia. Nothing too terrible there right now. Texas is doing okay. Texas has both characteristics we like to see, but it has them mildly. It is very slightly seeing a day-over-day reduction in new cases, 2% per day, and is very slightly angled downward. So if Texas can hold that pose, it'll get over it. But it's not getting over at the speed that we see on some of the other ones, like New York. New York actually is fairly flat now in its trend, in its growth, but it's negative. The growth is negative, but it's not accelerating. But New York is doing so well that I'm not worried. I think if they keep seeing that reduction, they'll be fine. They've already cut 75 to 90% of their cases daily. All right. If there's anything you want to look at, put it in the chat that I'm not pointing to. Testing by state. Rhode Island. home of CVS pharmacies. I again think that's why. I think CVS is the reason why Rhode Island is doing better. I don't have really obvious, clear evidence of that, but I have a little bit of a few articles I saw that suggest this. And so I guess the answer or the solution to the next pandemic is start a pharmacy in your home state. Rhode Island has tested 7% of the population, way above everyone else. New York is doing great at 5%. Massachusetts, great, also about 5%. Louisiana is doing great at almost 4%. And then there's the rest. Tennessee's pretty good. New Jersey, I guess, pretty good. California, let's look at Colorado, actually. Colorado, where are you? Why do I not find Colorado when I want Colorado? I can't even see it blinking. All right, well, I'm going to turn on just Colorado, Ohio, and Texas and Louisiana just to get some of those things that are of particular interest to some of my crowd. Let me know if there's a particular state you'd like to focus on when I do this. Oh, and how can I forget California? So, is there anything else that I should be throwing in here? Maybe Michigan, just for kicks. Michigan really stands out right now as an accelerating trend. Their dots are above the trend line. We'll see this better in the next one, so I'm not going to focus on it too much, but they seem to be accelerating. Michigan doing well at 2.2% tested. Louisiana, we already said, is doing very well. California is doing pretty well, 1.8% tested. I spent my first few weeks of this live stream lambasting California, but they're doing well. They really are. 2%. California's doing well. Colorado at 1.5, not quite so well, but not terrible. And Texas doing okay. Ohio and what do we have besides Ohio? Oh, that's Texas. Okay, Texas has one good day. Just one good day. Looking just at Texas. Texas has there's some interesting characteristics here. Yeah, so again, we have this sense that Texas has suddenly accelerated because they're way above their trend line. So Texas hasn't tested that many people. Rhode Island, 7%, New York, 5%. But they're doing okay. Anything above 1%, I'd say, is okay. But there's some sense they've accelerated their testing. But that'll really come out in this chart. If lines that are headed upwards here are states that are accelerating their testing, not just testing the same number of people every day, but testing more and more. And if you look at the general trend of this, certainly seems to be that way. You don't see a lot of horizontal lines. Something's going on with Louisiana. I think it may have to do with missing data. Well, yeah, I don't know what's going on with Louisiana, but Louisiana doesn't seem to be accelerating, at least not according to this data. But Rhode Island is, even though they're still massively in the lead. I guess they have one bad day here, a couple bad days actually. So maybe Rhode Island isn't accelerating, but they're doing fine. They don't need to accelerate. Massachusetts seems to be accelerating. They're in the lead and accelerating. New York is slightly accelerating. Tennessee, Illinois, which is good because Illinois, I didn't talk much about Illinois. I'm going to go back there and look at them again in a minute because Illinois was sort of our trouble spot. But Illinois is doing great in the acceleration of their testing. If you look at them alone, Illinois has tested 2.6% of their population, but that is growing quickly. They tested 0.15% in a single day, which if you look at everyone else, that's right up in the, Rhode Island does better, but very few do 0.15%. That's good. But I really want to look at Illinois. I'm surprised I lost track of it here. Illinois, as we saw, is looking quite bad in its new daily cases, even per capita. In fact, I think per capita, is it the worst now? No, it's not. There are several others, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, but Illinois is the only one that's headed strongly upward, so it may beat everyone eventually. But let's look at the rope chart. The real question for me is not even how bad is it, but how bad is it going to get? And when we look at the rope chart for Illinois, the news is not bad. It's got a slight growth rate, 3%, but it's flat. Its growth rate is flat, and its most recent day had a 10% drop. So that's not enough to call a trend, but certainly the trend is clear that it has been flat, and flat will eventually get you above everyone else. It's still growing, but at least the growth isn't 25%, and at least it is not persisting this mini trend we saw where it looked like it was headed up towards 20% and above and accelerating. So Illinois is looking okay from the rope chart perspective of where is it headed, but it's not looking so great right now because it still has more and more new cases every day, and it already has a lot of cases. In the total new cases, it has 2,000 new cases every day. So it is gradually, without ever really showing runaway growth in this rope chart, it has gradually, just by sticking above zero for months, it has gradually taken a major position here. And so it has to get below zero if it's not going to take the lead. We don't want it to take the lead. We'd like to see Illinois recover, but it's not right now. Except that one point, that one slight note of optimism. All right, I'm going to go on to the counties of California. Taking another peek while that loads. All right, it's probably loaded by now. I'll just go right there. So, of course, Los Angeles leading, Riverside and San Diego in total cases. But how is it going in new cases? Well, Los Angeles leading, and this line at least does suggest that Los Angeles is not really doing any better. But if you look at the couple weeks trend, it looks like Los Angeles might be heading downward. We have this one extreme day, but if we didn't see that one, we'd really say Los Angeles has done better in the past couple weeks. And I'm guessing the rope chart, well, on the other hand, if you look at just the past few days, hard to say. We'll see what the rope chart says, but it's really hard to say whether LA is getting better or worse. San Diego and Orange and I guess Riverside are the other major contenders in new cases. Let's just look at the general shape of these. We're seeing a lot of hills, slight hills. Places like Santa Clara, hills are good. San Bernardino. Alameda seems to be forming a hill. Sacramento. So there are a lot of counties that seem to have peaked and they're getting better. But then there are these Orange and San Diego, which do not look at all good in this graph. Let's look per capita. I thought that was going to be Orange. There's San Diego. Imperial has always been showing up. They definitely had some sort of serious challenges there. I do think that they're getting better. They're small, so they don't contribute a lot to the total picture. But per capita, they are the worst county. Los Angeles also showing that upward trend. We'll see what the rope chart says. Tulare, not a huge county, but they're in the middle of our list. Orange, there's Orange. Kern, a few others that are trending upwards. So there are quite a few somewhat hot spots here still in California, but also a lot that are heading downward. You look at YOLO. YOLO just popped in here. It was up and now it's down. It seems to be doing well. Santa Barbara. But let's look at the rope chart. Where are these things trended in the next week, say? Well, YOLO is so, that's not YOLO. Solano. Interesting. I was going to say YOLO is small enough that we don't really necessarily believe anything that any of these graphs say. There's so much noise in the data when you get that few cases. But Solano is not so small, and yet it's showing a remarkable downward trend. So Solano, top 20, is trending downward. It definitely has a lot fewer cases than many. It's behind Imperial, and so all of these bottom 5 are to be taken with a grain of salt when we're trying to project trends. But when we get to Riverside, that's real. Riverside is big, it has a lot of cases, and it's showing a very nice trend here. 13% drop day over day, and trending downward, accelerating downward. San Joaquin, same. It's a significant contributor. Marin is small, but is looking good. Los Angeles. So now this is where the rope chart's, I think, interesting. The rope chart, in looking at the changes day over day of cases, is saying, as far as it can tell, Los Angeles is getting better. that it has in fact peaked some time ago, and if we look at it again on this, this is about where the rope chart is saying it peaked, and that it's headed downward. There's a lot of noise, and so the rope chart isn't showing a sharp 10 or 20% downward, but on the whole, the rope chart thinks that Los Angeles is getting better. Riverside also getting better. San Diego is kind of flat. I'm going with just the biggest ones here. Orange County, as we saw, is in some kind of trouble. It's seeing a 12% growth rate day over day and accelerating. San Bernardino is looking pretty good. Santa Clara, so-so. It's above zero and accelerating, but at least it's only 3% growth. Alameda, same as Santa Clara. San Francisco now is looking pretty good. 4% reduction day over day and accelerating. San Mateo also, which it looked like it was in some kind of trouble, but now it seems to have recovered. It seems to have turned the corner a few days ago, but just barely. Sacramento, not looking so great. Sacramento is showing a 5% growth and accelerating. So we have a mixed bag here. The rope chart as a whole, I don't know, you be the judge. Is it above or below zero? One thing I do see when I just squint and eyeball it is there seem to be more downwards than upwards. So even above, whether the county is above zero or below zero, it tends to be downward. And so the rope chart suggests that we're heading towards a better place for most counties, but there are certainly exceptions. Sonoma is the biggest one, and then the other ones we talked about. There are quite a few counties still that are not showing good short-term trends, and certainly a lot of counties that are still growing. They're still above zero. Now we saw even worse over this past weekend, I think it was, and we were wondering, maybe it was the previous weekend, is it just because testing is improving? Testing is improving, and so maybe some of these accelerations are due to improved testing as we get more and more cases, in which case we will see them trend back as the counties. There was a time 2-3 weeks ago where most of the counties were below zero and were shrinking in cases. That doesn't seem to be the case for the most part right now, but I'm hoping we're headed back there. Testing by county, San Francisco is doing great. They're also outstripping their trend line, which suggests that they're testing more and more. They're accelerating their testing. So San Francisco is clearly the winner. 2.7% is great. Good, I'll say. It's a good testing rate. Not world class, but good. Riverside, 2.1 is doing fine. San Mateo, San Diego, Los Angeles, importantly, 1.6, that's okay. Anything above 1% of total tested is good. I don't have the daily numbers here, but we can see when those lines rise. For instance, Marin seems to be outstripping its trend line a little bit. Mostly it looks like these are kind of following their trend line, but maybe a little bit above. We have Orange County slightly outstripping its trend line. So the testing in California is looking pretty good. I'm glad to be able to say that finally, because there were times 6 weeks or whenever I first started this where every single county was below 4% tested. Now we can say they're not just above 2% in some 0.4% it was, if I said that wrong. They really picked up testing, and they seem to be accelerating. So California testing is looking good. That's most of the news. To summarize, the counties are kind of break even in whether they're doing well or poorly. We're hoping this trend will be heading in a different direction, because right now it's not looking great. If you look at the state level, we have some trouble spots for sure, like Illinois. Washington, we don't believe is a real problem. Neither is Missouri. The trend line does say they're headed upward, but we don't really think that's a problem because of how few cases they have. So if you take those out, this is looking pretty good at the state level. Everyone is flat or trending downward. And this is very different from what we saw a week ago when we were saying, what is going on? Why do we have everyone, or half of the states, suddenly looking like they're breaking out into a new epidemic? No one looks like that anymore. A lot of them are still growing, but they're all flat or descending in their growth rates. So that's the states are looking better. And the world as a whole is looking flat, but interestingly, the individual countries in the top 25 really don't look flat. They look like they're doing pretty well. There's not a lot of really alarming news here. So the world as a whole is looking pretty good. That's the news. I obviously missed yesterday and have been missing some other days, and I'll be back tomorrow if I can be. I expect I will be, but sometimes the day just goes by and I don't do it. And there's something fun about that, because then we get a lot more change the next day. From one day to the next, there's usually not a lot changing, but 2 days is enough to have some interesting effects. So Thursday is my hardest day to do this on, so I'll probably try to do it tomorrow just to make sure I can. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. Thanks for watching.